First of all, thank you folks all for coming out tonight. This is great. Good to see you. Just really quick intros for those of you not familiar with these folks. Jaya's a partner at Foundation Capital, and you might know her from the context graph tweetstorm article that went viral earlier this year. It really popped, and she's written a bunch about that. Flo is the founder and CEO of Lindy, which recently had a pretty amazing launch this week with an AI teammate product. But Flo's been building stuff around agents for, I think, over 4 years now, like this kind of same thesis. So he's been very early to it. And of course, Swyx, who I feel like needs no introduction. If you don't know Swyx, he runs the Latent Space podcast, which is incredible. He's the creator and the organizer of the AI Engineer World Fair, which is now a global conference, and has also worked with companies like Cognition and a bunch of AI companies. So thank you guys for being here. It's great. So I think getting started here, the thing that was on my mind to get started is what's changed. We did this event like about 3 months ago, which still in the AI world feels like a decade. That's taken part. What is your top highlight, maybe each of you, from the last 3 months? Like what's changed in the world that you think is like the biggest shift?
I think I have at least 5x my spend on everything. I don't know how common that experience is, but that is just a significant amount. Like I think we used to laugh at we're probably in 5,000 per person right now. We used to laugh at like $200 a month subscriptions, and now we get multiple of them. And we used to say those people were weird. And now I'm like, no, actually, I need those resets, please, OpenAI. And so it's actually a very interesting, that's the use case of it. As long as you are finding interesting use cases and are able to turn that into something useful for your business, then you should throw all the money at it, because it is preferable to hiring a human. And that's changed for me.
Well, how about you?
Yeah, I think we'll look back on summer 26 as the season when AGI arrived. I think it's here. I've been saying for a long time, like AGI is coming. I no longer say AGI is coming. I say AGI is here. I think we're now going through takeoff. For the longest time, we've been describing, the AI employee, and we've not had the AI employee for a long time. We've had like AI agents that kind of work, kind of don't, and we've not really had this like drop-in replacement for a remote coworker. Now we have it. I think open source happened over the last 3 months in a very, very big way. We made an announcement like 3 months ago that made like a lot more noise than I expected, but like we switched our main model that powers Lindy to DeepSeek. And we've been keeping an eye on open source for a long time now. And every time you see the benchmarks, you see the press releases, and every time it's like, it's just as good as Sonnet for 1/10 of the price. And it's like, all right, let's run it on our evals. And sure enough, every time it was vastly overblown. Now it's real. It's actually the open source models are actually super legit and incredibly cheap. So yeah, AGI is here and open source happened.
Yeah, and maybe to add on to that, I think every single time open source models have come out over the past 3 years, everyone's always been like, oh my gosh, it's open source, it's back. And then 2 weeks later, we don't hear about it. I think that this time around, at least from like what we've seen just from our portfolio companies, we've actually actively seen them moving from OpenAI and Anthropic to open source models. And I think that that's also coming into question just on the VC side. Like, growth investors are also asking more questions around like, the famous margin question that I think, people weren't asking the last 3 years, because it's like, just go get as many customers as you can. But I do think margins are being called into question now. And it's like, I think we're also seeing this is from the enterprise buyer side. I think because everyone blew through their sort of Anthropic budget really, really quickly, people are now like, I need to diversify and think, do we actually need these intelligent models?
Yeah. Concurrent to the open source thing, I think inference has become a lot more of its own field, like literal inference clouds that we don't do any training, we only do inference. They're not decacorn companies. And that you did not 3 years ago, I would have been like, no way. Like you're sort of, it's sort of like a derivative long bet on open source models, but then that's really come up. And I do think that is true. One of the prep questions that they sent us was like, what do you think you're really betting on that is maybe non-consensus over the rest of the year. And I think it's really, I guess, American open source models, to some extent, like the Thinkies, the Poolsides, but Meta, really actually coming out after a year of personal superintelligence and actually open sourcing their true models. I think it's actually like really interesting because they are probably the dark horse right now in terms of the frontier lab race that no one's really counting. And it is absurd that America doesn't have a open models champion the same way Europe has Mistral. That's weird. Like, let's fix that.
What do you think the business model is around the open source models? Can you talk about that a little bit? Or maybe I'm curious, like, is it the inference that goes to them, or is enormous amounts of capital that need to go into train these things?
No idea.
I think it's basically what DeepSeek is doing right now, which is like you make a big splash by being open source, and then you are also solving it. It's the same like business model as like any open source software company. It's like, well, open source, but then hey, we have a hosted solution that's like really good, and MongoDB, like Docker, like that's just the open source business. But like LangChain is now like doing quite well with this. So I think that's just what they're gonna do. They're gonna be like, oh, well, open source, and so that gives you a huge bump because people really love open source. If you want to be killed on Twitter, by the way, just say something bad about open source models, you're gonna have like a terrible night. I got booed so hard. And then they're just going to solve their own inference.
Yeah, I think it's a hard question, but I think that what I've seen some companies do is at least like figure out like what are the value added services on top of this. And so, someone like Palantir is saying, okay, we can take these models, but we're also becoming your control layer and control plane. And we're going to go automate, or not automate, but we're going to go take care of this like fleet optimization use case. And as a function of that, we're going to make sure, I think Alex Karp said, the frontier labs are taking your IP. And so I think that's another way to call it into question. I think inference is also the main use case that we've seen for it.
Yeah. I think we're all working at the application layer, building stuff in that. I don't know if is anybody here training models? Anybody dropping a couple billion on a training set? Maybe a couple. I'm curious to ask about this. Like, is the models the constraint for this going forward? Like you mentioned, AGI is here. I know Anthropic and OpenAI and others will keep releasing new capabilities. Are they good enough for what you shipped this week? It seems like it.
Yeah, I think the model is no longer the bottleneck. I think intelligence is no longer the bottleneck. I think one intuition pump to verify how true that is just imagine you're at work, you're at the office, and like the smartest man in history, like Einstein or John von Neumann, like appears next to you, right? He's useless. Like John von Neumann is useless in that moment. Like you're in a meeting, it's like, oh my God, John von Neumann is here now. It's like, what do you do? It's like, well, you're just going to continue your meeting. Like you're actually going to talk to your teammate or talking to John von Neumann because the teammate's got all the context loaded. And so I think right now we have John von Neumann and we have like that useless John von Neumann in the room. And it's time to actually onboard them and give them access to the tools and do figure out like the whole governance and the permissioning system and the context system and all of that. I think that's now the bottleneck. But the intelligence is basically good enough now to have like a full-blown AI employee.
Because Flo enjoys a good argument, I will just disagree with everything he just said. Please, yeah, I know.
You guys are agreeing too much. I need to ask harder.
Yeah, that is something that Michael prompted us to like, don't agree too much. Skill issue, bro. You are not working on hard enough problems. You're selling to the mids. I have several tasks I've been throwing for literal days, 5.6 Sol and Fable, and they're not being solved. So for example, I'm currently trying to build GitHub, and it is screwing up some of my deployment infrastructure and like all this coordination of complex things. GitHub's fine. Like obviously that's a very complex piece of infrastructure. You don't expect to write code GitHub. But then I was like, okay, like I also want to build like Wikipedia, like Rockipedia, right? Like let me just AI engineer this thing, and it's still not good. And then, well, okay, let me scale down my ambitions. Let me like try to look at my skills and audit those skills. And even skill creation, I literally just complained in the OpenAI Slack today, like it's bad. I don't know if you're like creating and using the skill creators things. Everyone's nodding along. And so like if you're not careful about what you put into your models, they will go wrong, right? And the fact that you have to care is not AGI, right? The fact that they don't have the judgments to be like, well, you just gave me some irrelevant information, or you didn't give me enough information. I'm just gonna go off and do whatever literally you told me to do. that's wrong. Like a model would be smarter enough to push back. You're nodding a lot, so I'm just gonna let you carry here.
Well, yeah, I think in some use cases, like I think the model's actually just too intelligent for the task. I think like if someone's using like solving customer support tickets and they're like using Fable 5, I think I would short the company. And I think one public company CEO actually, it was funny, he said this, but he was like, if I don't want every single employee on Fable 5 because it's like, it's overthinking for most of my use cases, and like I actually just need to focus on execution versus and context matters much more for intelligence for most of my use cases, and think the company is like a large retailer. They don't really need all their engineers to have like IMO level intelligence to query every day.
Yeah, I love it because on my left I have like, oh, it's still not AGI. It's like too dumb. And here I have like, oh, it's too smart. And I'm literally in the middle, so I'll just like leave you guys at it. Yeah, I think like, look, if I ask my human employees to build GitHub or Wikipedia, like they can't either, right? Like you need a leader, or you need like an orchestration layer. I think if you actually use like dynamic arbitrary, like using like dynamic workflows and like a verification loop and like a slash loop and a slash good and all of that stuff, I actually do think today's models have it in them to give you a Wikipedia and a GitHub.
Yeah, it's not good.
Oh, well.
Yeah. It's I moved the bars to like if you've read the slop that it generates, it's not good slop. And like I'm trying to define what good means, and even so, like literally, a very simple thing you can do at home today is take your frontier model of choice, whatever it is, take an image gen design. Let's say like design WorkOS's website, design the AIE website, and then try to replicate it like pixel perfect in your coding model of choice. It's going to get it wrong. It's actually like really bad at like just even like a beautifully designed thing. I don't know if you strongly disagree, but like this is a very consistent experience of mine. And so like I think like it's really upon us to not be satisfied with the current state of things. That's where humans really still have a job. And then also like try to build evals for that, or try to build harnesses for that, to basically bring forward the future, because hopefully the model people will figure that out at some point, and they will actually pay you for your information, whether they pay you in access or pay you in money. But if you can reliably define where you're unhappy with models, you're a more valuable contributor to the AI economy than someone who is like, models are great, let's just, future is here, not evenly distributed, let's just distribute it everywhere. People are still very, very focused on trying to find the frontier and pushing it.
You mentioned harness. I'm wondering if like the harness engineering is a piece of this. Like a year ago we were coordinating sub-agents and Ralph loops were a brief moment in time, less than a year. Is that the limiter to be able to use the current models to execute like you're looking at for GitHub? I'm also wondering if like Lindy is a harness, a form of a harness. Do you think about it as that way?
It is. We hate it.
Look, we have like a complete. Sorry to call it harness. Yeah.
No. Like what we hate about it is that we did build our own harness. We have a complicated history because, to your point, we've been building AI agents since 2022. It was like GPT 3.5, and so there was no tooling, there was no ecosystem like evals, like there was no eval solution, there was brain trust, there was no like third-party harness. Little known fact, I actually don't know if I've ever like talked about it publicly. We made like in hindsight, laughably low acquisition offer to Harrison at LangChain in Q3 2022 when he still had a job. And so, we've been working on this for a while. And so we unfortunately built our own harness. And we built our own eval tooling, and we built everything in-house. And like, don't do this at home. I do not recommend it. Because like, there's actually really good harnesses out there. The Maestra right now would be our like, it's not really a harness, it's more like a framework. But there's like really good harnesses out there. So to answer your question, I do think the harness really matters, but simultaneously, the gap between the 25th percentile harness and the 75th percentile harness does not straddle the viability line. Like, the 25th percentile harness is going to do most of your tasks anyway. It's going to be expensive, it's going to be slow, it's going to retry, it's going to get stuck in loops, but it's going to do it anyway.
God, I should probably stop turning this off. I think that there is an interesting if you sort of look at harness philosophy or harness commentary on Twitter, you often find here things like, well, we just have less stuff in our harness, therefore we perform better. You hear this a lot with Pi, that's a lot of the marketing. And then with Claude, every model release, they always somehow cut 70% of the context. And I'm like, well, okay, you're just piling up a lot of slop in there, I guess. I don't know. There is a lot of tasteful engineering that is done in terms of like what context you expose to it and what tools you give it. And I think there's a generally emerging consensus of what you give the harness as tools. Basically, that is also a nice interface for the post-training people to optimize towards. And everyone knows like you should probably try to adopt whatever it was post-trained for. Otherwise, you're really just going against the grain there. I do think like you basically want to try to take out the harness by everyone adopting the same level of interface, and probably it is some kind of sandbox, probably is some kind of search. Like the sort of key tools of harness engineering have already emerged. The main thing that is uncertain right now is memory and continual learning, which this is why I talk about skills so much, because basically you should try to never repeat mistakes in your company or your coding agents. So the only way to do that right now is to store memory, and storing memory is really bad still. People say ChatGPT has improved a lot. I don't see it that often, but like ultimately, ideally you want to remember from mistakes, because that's the only way you scale. And I don't see that happening yet.
We actually have something that we're playing with these days that we'll probably release it at some point, so I can talk about it. It doesn't matter. It's hot take. I actually think this will become a pattern for agents in the next 6 months. I think agents creating their own evals is going to become a thing. So one thing we're playing with is like when we give feedback to Lindy right now, she modifies her memory, she makes changes to her prompt and all of that stuff, and then she creates her own eval from that task, and she replaces that task to verify that change can probably increase the performance of that given task. It's still like a prototype, but I actually think this is going to be the pattern that gives us something closer to like continual learning, like verifiably.
Yeah, it's weird because not just you should create your own eval, you should create your own labeling interface, and then you should kick off multiple runs to see if things are doing. And so engineering is looking like ML research. I am babysitting runs, I am doing labeling, I'm doing evals, and I'm not updating weights, but I am updating the harness. And it is very interesting that like actually the costs are also increasing as well. Like literally I will spend $1,000 optimizing harnesses because then I can use that for, indefinitely, and that's great.
Jaya, you wrote this post about the context graph, which you told me backstage that it almost was context layer. I think context graph is a spicier name. It's great. Context graph is really about teams, like companies bringing information in together, as I understand it. How does this match to like the continual learning, the skills, the evals? Do they blend together? What's your update on the context graph?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny, like I posted it on December 22nd, and I think skills was sort of becoming a thing early January, and that's like when I had to completely update my view. I think that context is more broad than just the things that you put into a skill. Like I think a skill is a very small representation of like all of context. And I think that the updated view is really like, I think a lot of companies that I talked to after that post, like most were not capturing context, especially like F500 companies. I think everyone in SF is using Granola, now maybe using Granola in their coffee chats, and like they're recording everything, but that's not a thing in most companies. And so I think that the definition of context is really, really different, especially if it's like a physical world business. Like context for them might be like sensors in their factory or like video camera footage. And so I think that was one thing that was big. And I think the other updated view was really like around like most companies, I think their context is trapped in people's heads. And I think people like for a normal employee, that context might actually be their IP. Like knowing exactly like how what I know about this row and this massive database, and like being able to extract that context out of someone and turn it into a skill per se is a really political thing. And so I think that we've also seen some backlash against skills at many companies too.
I've heard a lot about like deleting your skill files.
Delete your skill files.
Have you deleted your skills, Lindy?
No, I love my skill files. Don't touch my skill files. No, why would I do my skill files? What we've seen work, by the way, about like extracting the information from the person's head is like the way you align the incentives, at least over the short term, is that, and I was showing, Swyx and I were meeting, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, and I was sharing my screen, like something happened to me. I keep talking about my product, by the way, like my objective is not to sell my book or whatever. Patty was, but he's great.
I'll plug Lindy for you later.
Thank you. Every time I say Lindy, I'll show you, and you can say Lindy for me. And then, so I was on Lindy, and I was asking about like a candidate I had just met, and I was like, hey, what did you think? I was on the fence about the candidate. I was like, what do you think? And Lindy pulled a skill that I did not know had just been created by our recruiter. And she's like, oh, well, this is actually how we screen candidates. And like, oh, he checked this box, then here he was weaker. And the reason why our recruiter did that is because it was helping her at her job, right? And so I think if you align the incentives in a way that like the individual has to create skills because it aligns them at their job, and by default, and it's really important, by default, that skill that this person creates because it makes them better at their job gets added to the team library. That's how you get that flywheel going.
Oh, I'll just plug Drew Brunick online has a skill doctor thing that you can run. It hooks into the popular coding agents skill usage statistics, and you can sort of see if there's anything to clean up. I think it's just a skill hygiene type of thing. I do also think that I wish it was easier to turn on and off skills for different models, because some as models upgrade, you may need less and less skills or less prescriptive skills, and that is completely untouched in current harnesses.
Maybe we should have a skill swap at the after party. You guys can.
Oh yeah, we're launching a new newsletter next week that helps people share skills. I think so. Somebody's gonna buy this. Skillshare, like skillshare.com, is available online right now for $3,000. I'm really figuring out if I should buy this thing because people are gonna confuse it for Skillshare. But it'll just be funny for the joke.
What do you all think wins as these AI teammates we start collaborating more with agents? Is it like a single general purpose agent that has all these skills in your organization, like an omnipresent, agent inside of your Slack? Is it a bunch of these specialized agents for different tasks, that you spin up? Some kind of vertical agent? Like what's the end state here? What do you see?
This is a deep question that none of us know the answer to, but I've experimented with a lot. My team is very unfortunate because I make them try everything. Claude, Tad, Victor, Town, Lindy, right? And I think that there's different stages, and also our hand-rolled one, AIE bot. There's very different approaches to agent identity. Claude is really trying to make Claude its own entity. That's why you have to add Claude, you have to set up an own Gmail for Claude. The other guys don't do that. Grok bot today launched a completely different philosophy where you have multiple agents doing specialist things, and then I think Lindy is also more on the Claude side where you have a Lindy, right? Anyone that's like a personified human is a general task. I think one pattern I haven't seen that other people are all hand rolling, which is something that is a theme, is the personal chief of staff thing. So everyone has a twin. There's a Michael twin, there's a Jaya twin, there's a Flo twin. I think that makes sense until you try to pwn that bot, and then you can just I can read all the data that you can see, and that's bad, right? So like that permissioning system is crazy. Nobody has any answer, and I think it's kind of the Wild West. I don't have anything beyond that apart from I think it also it varies by your company maturity, like what is appropriate for you, as well as what people you have. So I have Codex has been my chief marketing officer for the last month or so for Latent Space. Drives my ads, drives my YouTube, drives A/B testing across everything. It's doubled my subscribers. And I don't have the money to pay a CMO, but I can pay Codex $200 a month to do random experiments and research for me. And I think depending on your size, you can have the specialist guy, or you can have the twin, you can have the God AGI. It's really dependent on you, and there's a range of options right now.
We've spent maybe cumulatively 100 hours debating this question, more than that at Lindy, if you count all of us together, maybe 1,000 hours. We have swung back hard on the pendulum. We used to be many agents, now we're one big agent. I think we're gonna reintroduce a couple of agents underneath the big agent. That's going to be an interface to the small agents. I think there are some reasons to have like multiple agents. I think like you get encapsulation of privileges and permissions, you get more shareability, you limit the blast radius of the changes to your agent. So like there's a couple of really nice properties. You can still encapsulate like context better in a single agent, in multiple agents. So that's good. I think though, it's really funny. There is this pattern every time there is a technological revolution where people use the new technology in the ways the old one was used. Like the first content on TV was like literally recorded radio talk shows. They put a camera on a recorded radio talk show. That's what like Jimmy Kimmel is basically, right? Or like they record like theater plays, And so it takes a very long time to find the form of content that's native to a new technological paradigm. I think the reason why people tend to default to many agents is because they mistakenly think of AI organizations in the same way they think of human organizations. Human organizations have a lot of employees, because humans are limited. They have only 24 hours a day and they can only hold so much content and skills in their head at the same time. So they have to specialize. AI agents have neither of these constraints. So insofar as there remain reasons to have multiple agents, and there are still reasons to have multiple agents, those two reasons are not part of the mix. And I think those are the main reasons today which drive fragmentation of agents / employees inside companies.
Yeah, I think it's just super highly dependent on who you are and what the company is, because I think there's, a lot of developers in SF, I feel like they're the fastest to switch. They have like 16 different agents running at all times, whether it's, one weekend they're like, we love Cloud Code, the next week it's Codex, the next week it's Kimmy. And so I think that that's one side of the group. And then there's people, large companies that, they get their $1,000 credits on Cowork and that's all they use. And whoever runs IT at the company is now thinking about switching to Codex because they drop prices. And so they'll switch to Codex. And so I think it really, really depends on where you work and how much flexibility they give you. I also think that the AI chief of staff, or this like AI personal assistant thing, people have tried this for the last 3 years. And I think 90% of companies we've seen like have not made it past the 2 or 3 year mark. I actually went and recently surveyed we probably saw 50 pitches of like AI chief of staffs and AI personal assistants, and I think 47 of them are no longer that have made it. And I think now the capabilities are better, but I think no one's really cracked the interface thing yet. And maybe it'll be Grokbot, maybe it'll be something else. So we'll see.
Last question, rapid fire. We're back here in like 4 months. We're hanging out at the WorkOS holiday party, say mid-December. What's the bet that you would make that we're gonna hit by then? What's gonna change? Where do you think we'll be?
I think to your point, it's funny, swyx, because in the same breath you say like we don't have AGI, and by the way, I have an AI CMO that doubled my subscriber base. I think
That does very routine advice,
right.
Any CMO would tell you.
Totally. I think people should feel ready in the next 4 months for anywhere between 40 and 60% of all the activities currently performed by the companies to be performable by an agent. And I think whether they actually do end up being performed by an agent or not is up to everyone.
I think that we'll probably see a shift to like local models. I think that not everything will get sent to the cloud, and people will probably realize like we can do a lot of this stuff locally.
I've been very infra-pilled recently, and I think recently is a relative term. Faster chips across the entire semiconductor stack. I know that this is it's relatively consensus now, but it is still going. I think people look at the max of what speed looks like to be Cerebrus, where you have, instead of 70 tokens per second, you have 750. I encourage you to think about a world in which you have 100,000 tokens per second, because that is happening. And that is the possibility of ASICs versus GPUs. And if you really, really take inference seriously, which we are starting to do now because agents, then you should think about that.
I love it. Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight.
Yeah.